I'm the president of Liftport Group. We've been doing these podcasts since about October, so really want you to take a look at our DareGreatly Space podcast on Spotify. Take a look at our YouTube channel. We got a ton of stuff there. We've been doing hundreds of individual interviews over the last 3.5 years. We've had the chief scientist of U.S. Space Force. We've had two different 3-star generals. One has become a 4-star general, General Salzman, that has become the chief of space operations, the leading general of Space Force. We've had the deputy administrator of NASA, Lori Garver. Let's see. The historian, the chief historian of NASA, the chief economist of NASA nominated, the chief economist of NASA. We've got some really terrific people, and that's on the government side, Space Force and NASA side, but also folks from other countries, about 5 or 6 venture capital firms, leadership in many different companies to talk about space, right? And the things that we cover are the things we've been doing for a while now. So we kind of break it into 3 big topics. Infrastructure, that's the hardware of going to space. Money, how much does it cost? Who's spending it? Where's it coming from? Where's it going? And then policy, whether federal policy, doctrine from Space Force, what's happening in Europe. And the way that we do this, there's kind of 3 formats, is we have a news program, a news roundup show. We also do a deep dive into a document, really do some analysis. And then our favorite kind of show, the kind of show that we're having tonight, is with our guests. And we've had some just amazing guests over the last almost a year. So pretty excited to bring these folks on. I'll have them introduce themselves in a second. We'd love it if you are watching this on YouTube, if you would share, like, and subscribe. That would always be great. Our YouTube channel is where most of this content is held. We have hundreds of episodes there. We only have a couple dozen on the Spotify channel. So Spotify is a little bit newer for us. We have a Discord channel that is maybe not as active as we'd like it to be, but we post a lot of current events of news on that channel. So definitely check that out. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring on our guests. Just a second, please. Let's see, do this. And that. Ta-da. Hey, y'all.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey. This is actually the first time that we've had 2 guests at the same time. Believe it or not, that out of hundreds of interviews, we usually just do a one-on-one. So that's going to be kind of fun that we have both of you here for that. So let's talk about this for a second. The way the show works is we kind of always start off with an origin story, kind of getting a little bit of your background. Because this industry is brand new, there's a lot of people that have preconceived ideas about how to get in here, right? Into this field, into this sector. I myself have a pretty bumpy path. Leah has one path, or my team, and Rachel has a different path. So we all kind of have different paths to get here, and that's one thing we want to encourage is that there's no correct way of getting here, and this space sector of ours, this commercial space sector of ours, is a little bit of the wild, wild west. Like there's a lot of different things. And if you're interested in the field, in the sector, there's probably a way for you to get involved. So we want to kind of showcase and encourage folks to reach out. So let's have you all talk about your individual origin stories, first personally, and then we'll get to off-planet research after that. Okay? Who wants to
Definitely. And we're glad to be your first podcast guest, I guess.
Mhm.
It's funny, our very first conference that we presented at in, I think it was 2017, we also co-presented, and I have never seen it since then. So we didn't know it at the time, but we think it was unusual then as well. But no, actually OPR 2 weeks ago just celebrated our 8th birthday. So,
Wow.
new space, how new is new space? Is the question. So, in that regard,
well, you've been on my shows several times, right? Whether it's stuff for the Mars Society or Foundation for the Future, or just our independent shows. You've been on several shows that we've had. So independently, we've had just you, but not Vince. In fact, I didn't even know that Vince actually existed. I thought he was a figment of your imagination for a while.
we let him out of the lab occasionally.
Okay. All right.
Someone has to keep the lights running.
Tell us your origin story. How did you get into space in general?
Oh, you want me to go first?
Go for it.
Okay, great.
Okay. Okay. Well, Jack Schmidt loves it when I tell this story because it ages him. But when I was a little kid, like a lot of people that are in space now, I remember being called in by my parents to watch this really cool thing on TV. And I looked on TV and I saw this guy jumping around on the moon and getting stuff. And he kind of fell over a little bit and other people were making fun of him. And someone said, yeah, that's Jack Schmidt, everybody. And I remember looking at it, and my dad, who at the time he worked on the Apollo program. He was an engineer at Boeing, and he said that's the first scientist that has ever been on another planet.
Wow.
And I remember we sat there and we watched that, and I remember thinking, I'm going to be that scientist that's on another planet doing stuff. And then fast forward about many years, I'm standing at LPSC talking to Jack Schmidt, who's on a panel, and I'm like, you're the reason that I'm here. And it was important for me to tell him that.
Yeah.
I don't mean to date you. And he kind of stood up out of his chair a little bit. He said, well, you just did. He's a great guy. And he is.
Which mission was that? What year was that?
That was
Apollo 17.
Yeah, 1970.
Okay. Yeah.
72.
Anyway, and Jack from that day forward was one of my heroes. And so I got to actually meet and converse with and loosely collaborate with one of my heroes.
Wow.
And that's how I got into space. And not only because of Jack, but also because of my dad, who, like I said, was an engineer and worked on Apollo and all kinds of other space programs. Anyway, so it took me, for various reasons, it took me about 30 years to finally finish my bachelor's degree and then complete my master's degree, going back and forth between college and raising a family. So that bumpy road that you mentioned, actually, I think that's an incredible strength of where space is coming from now, because we're trying to solve so many amazing, unique problems that it does take a diversity of experiences and opinions to solve these really difficult problems. So that was my path to space. And then when I was completing my degree, I met this amazing person. And after she shares her origin story, then we can talk about the crazy that happened then.
Cool. I will point out, you are a second generation spacer, and honestly, that's pretty rare. That is really, really shockingly rare.
I have a picture of I have a picture of my dad working on the Redstone rockets down in Alabama. And in this picture, my dad is at one end of a Redstone rocket, and at the other end is Wernher von Braun. And they're talking back and forth about calibrating the guidance and navigation and control systems. And that's one of my favorite pictures.
Wow. Yeah, that would be a family treasure. That's an heirloom for sure. Wow, that's amazing. My family does not have a picture like that.
It's one of my favorites.
Well, and maybe I should have gone first then. Mine's a whole lot less heartwarming than that. No, I grew up here in Washington, specifically in the northern Washington area where Boeing is based. And so being around the aerospace industry my whole life, when I decided to go into mechanical engineering, it was with the intention of working at an aerospace company, whether that be Boeing or one of the other many companies in this area that supports aviation. And in fact, actually, I did some internships at small aerospace companies in the Everett area during my university experience.
And which school? Y'all both went to the same school?
Yes. Yeah, we went to a university here in the state where we met and did my internships here as well. Was planning to go that route. I mean, again, why not? Stay close to home, do awesome things. And then I met Vince in some classes at the college, and he was telling me about this interesting work that he was doing, and we went on to do a senior design project together. And then the company as well continued off of there. And I think the origin story about the company in and of itself is also really interesting. And it's, the mid 2010s at this point. Google Lunar X Prize is alive and well. Back then it was.
Let's have some background on GLXP from your perspective. I'm going to add some stuff to it, but tell folks again. There's a lot of people new to this industry, so talk about a little bit about GLXP for a second.
Well, I'm sure it morphed quite a bit, but by the time we got involved, the focus was on getting a small rover to the lunar surface, being able to do that successfully, and then I think it was being able to move, correct?
Collecting a sample and sending it back to Earth. That was the goal.
Yeah.
And it was founded on the same idea. They got Lindbergh across the Atlantic. Was there's a lot of great ideas out there and a lot of people that are really smart. Let's put up this prize, and whoever gets there first gets the prize, and it'll motivate people to do this. And it did that.
Yeah.
It proved to be a much harder goal than the originators of the contest thought it was, primarily because the transportation aspect, the getting a payload to the lunar surface in one piece,
right,
was not as developed as it could have been. But what it did do is it started a whole slew of companies that are around still, such as us and other companies you might have heard of, bigger companies. But
we were not a competitor at any point in time. Right. I do want to clarify that, Michael.
That is true.
But we formed with the idea in mind. Again, we're mechanical engineers. Let's send something to the lunar surface. Yeah. From Vince's perspective, space was always his focus. From my perspective, we're just going to go a little bit further out into the atmosphere than aviation. Why not? And so the goal was to be able to actually develop technology. The thing is, when you're trying to develop technology for this very prestigious competition, that's going to be very expensive, as Vince said, with the lack of rideshare options that exist today, you need to have supporters and funders and investors. And in order to get those investors, you need to be able to prove it's going to work when it actually gets there. And in order to prove it's going to work, you need to have access to good testing materials and good testing services. And again, back in the mid 2010s, that was a lot more limited than it was now, especially with the focus being more on Mars than on the moon. So there really were not active lunar regolith simulant providers. It was all historical stock that had been made, some of it in the early 2000s or late 2000s, but a lot of it even earlier. Yeah. And so that was one element. And then there really weren't a lot of testing facilities outside of NASA. And trying to get into NASA with a small project, especially related to the moon, would have been a lot more challenging at that time. And so for those reasons, we decided to start with the foundation or the ground floor of the building before you start constructing on it. And we really looked at okay, there's this really interesting, abrasive, destructive soil on the lunar surface. How can we really replicate some of those natural formation processes here on Earth to create these, replicated lunar soils for use in testing and research? And so we started there and spent a lot of time, several years, in fact, developing the simulants.
Yeah, we wanted something that we would be confident to use. That when we said, okay, here's some technology we developed and we've tested it, we wanted to be able to say, for certain that it was going to work. And so we designed our simulants and our methodologies to achieve that goal. And at the same time, as Melissa pointed out, it was what a lot of other people needed as well.
Yeah.
Right.
And so it served a dual purpose of meeting our goals while helping other people meet theirs. And all kinds of positive reasons for doing that, from building relationships to developing the actual technology, and to, as a new business, having a product that you could put out there that would have a more immediate return than 20 years down the line when you might get to the moon. So
Yeah.
it made good business sense, and it made good philosophical sense, and it made good engineering sense.
And from that perspective, as well as wanting to be able to use this and supply it to others, we wanted to be able to provide options. Because, again, you're going to send this really highly refined equipment to another environment. You want to make sure it can operate there. And the moon is not homogeneous. And it's not just one simulant.
Or two or three.
Or even two or three, yeah. And so that was something that, back in the day, if you got a simulant, you got that simulant. There were no choices. It was most likely a Mare simulant or heavily basaltic. Occasionally, there were a few that were more for the highland regions, which are the lighter areas on the moon, that are more northacidic. But you kind of got what you got. And it might have been used before, it might have been fresh, it might be different from the batch you got, a year ago. And so those were really things that we wanted to change. And so being able to make our simulants on the component level, literally having each sieve size of our feedstocks, allowed us to produce a range of general as well as custom simulants. Okay, you don't want certain size particles, great. You want to alter the composition, great. Because we make the simulants to order so that the client can customize it if needed. And if not, they still, though, have a wider selection than was ever previously offered. So those are things we're really proud of.
Oh, no, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to get us back on track, but if you want to stay on this diversion, by all means.
I want to
two other things that are really important.
Yeah.
There were components of lunar regolith that were not available, to people to utilize, and that was agglutinates were a really big thing. And agglutinates are an extremely important part of regolith. It changes the mechanical properties. It changes the chemistry. It changes everything. So you needed to have that, and that was one of the first things we tackled as soon as we put together a base simulant. And the second thing is the concept that if you test in a simulant that's good for a certain landing site, then you can only say for sure that your technology will work at that landing site.
Right.
So what NASA learned early on during the Apollo missions was you want to test in a broad range of simulants to make sure that you can work when you get there. And so that's why it's important to not just use one or even two simulants. You want to test on a broad range.
So let's go back to in the 2010s. I would say there were probably 12 credible teams. Maybe there were 26. I just made up a number. There were more teams, but not everybody was credible, right? I had the fortune and then immediate misfortune of being one of the very first hires of Astrobotic, and there was some drama, and the guy who hired me immediately got himself fired, and because he was fired, by default, I was fired. So I was at Astrobotic for exactly 1 week and never received an official paycheck. It's a pretty funny story, but that was the early 2010s. And there was this scramble for who was going to be able to build stuff, and companies popped up left and right. Most of them don't exist anymore. Some of them have a bit of a soap opera story behind them about, coming alive, quickly dying, a little bit of resurrection, dying again. Like, there were a lot of companies that were part of that original GLXP. Those were also the years that I was doing a lot of stuff with the International Space University, and ISU was really involved with the GLXP because one of the three founders of ISU was also instrumental in creating the X Prize Foundation. So ISU definitely had some technical advantages and some relationship advantages in the early days. So there was a lot of hope about GLXP, and then over time, it was you had to drive half a kilometer, 500 meters, deliver high definition video, and the driving part was hard. Landing, we all know, because we're going to talk about it, we all know that landing is hard. But we didn't know that then, right? We didn't realize then how hard it was. And so everybody focused on the robots. And there are companies that have evolved away from that original GLXP mission plan that are going to the moon right now, right? Some have already started, some have already crashed, some are on their way as we speak. So that's a pretty impressive legacy. The original plan was it was going to be $20 million, and then it got moved up to $30 million. And then it was supposed to end within 5 years, and they're like, this is impossible, and then we're going to extend it, and then they extended it to 10 years, and they said this is impossible, and then they were going to extend it, and I think it officially got extended a total of 12 years, and eventually it was ended without a winner, even though there are solid companies out there now that got their start, Astrobotic being one of them, Intuitive Machines, iSpace. The Israeli program was part of that, Bereshit. I think there was an Indian program, although I'm not
Team Indus.
sure. Which one?
Team Indus.
Team Indus, exactly right. Okay, so I mean, real companies, real organizations that built real hardware that actually went to the moon. So even though the prize has expired, the ripple effects of creating the prize, we're still feeling that. So
yeah, and even the companies that didn't make it, the people that they pulled together and the work that they did, and a lot of those accomplishments are carried forward.
That's exactly what I was going to say. We know some people that were on some of those different teams that have ended up elsewhere.
Yeah,
and I think that's the great thing, was seeing them in that position, and then how they've been able to transfer those skills of it was very competitive at the time. I mean, it still is, but like that X Prize at the time, I mean, as you said, Michael, the number of businesses it spawned, sometimes repeatedly, was very radical in kind of developing the commercial side of the space industry.
Yeah, and what I love about it, that aspect moving forward, when you go to LPSC or LSIC, or you walk into this building and you're with your people. Like, these are hundreds and in some times thousands of people who they are at that spot doing what they're doing and have been doing it for so long because it is their absolute passion, and they really have faith in what it can do for humanity, and that's why they're there. And that transcends the business that you're in. It transcends the company that you're working for. Everything is this bright future, this bright horizon, and I think that what's carried forward from the X Prize is that legacy, and it's an amazing one.
Yeah. It's been remarkable. I don't want to get off track, but Virgin.
It's impossible.
It's impossible. Virgin launched its first commercial flights just a few days ago, and again has its origin stories in the original X Prize. So there's a long story behind that. We're not going to get into it, but there was Peter Diamandis walked across the stage in St. Louis, asked basically the Rotary Club for $50,000, and that $50,000 starting point has launched a global industry. So nice job, good job, Peter, for that work. We all have a debt to pay, of thanks to them. All right, let's stay focused here. All right, so that's in the early 2010s, but Melissa, you just said that you're 8 years old. So how did OPR happen? Right, so there's a gap there.
Let's clarify. Off-Planet Research just celebrated our 8th birthday.
Okay.
Melissa is older than 8 years.
I promise.
Okay, good.
Not as much as, I'm not quite where Vince is in life, but I'm of the current generation. But so Off-Planet Research, as I said, we kind of got our start with the Google InterX Prize, realized that, hey, let's back up a couple of steps first. Space is hard, that's why Virgin Galactic was supposed to do flights how long ago with their projections, just like all these other companies. Yep. Space is hard, it takes time, but I think the fact that it's not, you can't rush it. Like you need to fully work out that R&D process is really where we want to come in. Our goal is to provide mission assurance so that you don't have to cash in on your mission insurance. If you test it, thank you. If you test it while here, really trying to not only succeed in your mission goals, but hopefully exceed them as well. Really get the samples that you want to get and maybe collect a few additional samples. Or, if you're able to traverse another 500 meters or a kilometer, what might you discover in that time period, even just from your optical systems? And so really that is what we want to do as engineers, is help others with what they're doing. Have us be a little bit of a part of all these different projects. But we also want to develop hardware ourselves. That's, again, why we got into this. And so after spending a lot of time developing a range of simulants, we have gotten back to those engineering roots and done some technology development. So that brings us, Michael, into the 2020s. There we go. And really doing a focus on dust tolerant mechanisms. So utilizing our experience working with this very fine, very abrasive material, how can we create components that can help other technologies survive longer, or protect them from the dust, hold up better in the dusty environment. And so that's been a focus of ours, developing icy regolith simulants, again, for use in doing a lot of testing with this focus on space resources and in situ resource utilization, being able to actually see how your system will stand up to some rather corrosive and reactive volatile components is kind of the goal. And so those are some areas that we've continued exploring in the late 2010s and early 2020s.
Yeah, it's interesting. You take this really incredibly destructive material, and then you add the ice components. And now not only is it incredibly destructive, but it reacts to you. You introduce, say, a slightly warm rover into some icy regolith simulant that has all the right components in it.
In a vacuum.
And it's a pretty glorious response. And
explain. Glorious reaction means what?
Well, so in our first experiments in 2018, we saw some interesting characteristics, but we're working on a small scale. This is our first time doing it. Okay, that's cool. We'll make a note of it. We then went to a conference, LPSC 2018, and we saw a researcher.
Planetary Science Center. Yep.
Perfect. You got it.
Thank you.
And we saw a researcher out of the UK at the time. I think she might still be there, but maybe not. Lauren McEwen, and she was presenting on carbon dioxide, dry ice in a Martian simulant in a vacuum. And she was working on a much larger scale with the dry ice than we were at the time. And she basically equated it to like a washing machine. Like it was, as it was volatilizing in a vacuum environment, it was really disturbing the surface of the regolith. Well, as Vince said, imagine that you're in a lunar PSR in this standpoint rather than Martian.
Region.
Yes, thank you. We will work on our acronyms. And
I've been doing this for a while, so I'm trying to like make sure my audience knows what you're talking about.
it's important things.
It is important. It is important.
So you're in a lunar permanently shadowed region. It's very cold. You have all these frozen volatiles just, laying there either on the surface or below the surface. And you start to cause them to heat up and react with one another or volatilize, which kind of means they go from frozen to gas.
And we're not talking frozen like I'm going to the freezer for an icy pop. We're talking frozen, what?
50 degrees above absolute zero.
Yeah.
Negative 100 and some odd degrees Celsius. It goes
sometimes more than that. It's
frighteningly cold.
Yeah.
Right. All right.
And
so now you've got this thermal environment where you've got something really cold and something that's pretty cold but warm by comparison, right? And then what?
Yeah, and so that is the question, Michael.
That is exactly the question.
And that's the question that we don't see enough people talking about is, everyone is fascinated by the water, and admittedly so. The water is glorious and wonderful and will be an amazing resource, but there's other things as well. And what those other things might do when they start to volatilize and react is going to be very interesting. So are you going to get that washing machine effect underneath your rover? Or if you don't get it then, when you start processing it and it's going through your processing plant, what's going to happen then?
Yeah.
Or once it's wet, how is that going to affect the flow characteristics? Because all of a sudden you're going from frozen to wet to dry. And I know Vince is very passionate about this.
Well, it's interesting because you are now talking from a design standpoint. If you're going to set up a piece of equipment that's going to take in this icy regolith on the moon and warm it up to extract off various things, and you're going to have to push this stuff through this processing plant, you're going to run into a very unique material that has never before been seen by humanity, and that is wet lunar regolith. And the simulants that we use, the stuff turns into Play-Doh.
Wow.
And try to push that through a processor. And there's all kinds of, that's just as an example, there's all kinds of bizarre things that happen as this material is warmed and pushed through, especially a confined space like a pipe or a warming compartment. And, there's so much work that needs to be done there, and it's going to be a heck of a lot of fun, and we can't wait to do it. So.
Yeah, more research is needed by everyone.
by everyone. I mean, I think that is fascinating. There's all this this hype about mining on the moon, like let's just go do it, as if we know what the heck we're talking about, right? As if we know, what's that line from The Martian? We're gonna science the shit out of it, right?
Like, can we say that?
I mean, Michael can say that.
Okay.
And there's this assumption that there's no unsolvable problem, right? But the fact is that we haven't been there in 50 years. Yep, there's a robot on the far side right now. So nice job. It's been operating for a long time and pretty effectively. So good for them. Good. There's 2 on their way right now. So fingers crossed that they don't become $100 million craters again. I want to be optimistic. We're not going to get into the politics of this, but there's a lot on the line for Russia right now. There's a lot on the line for their landers. So I wish them the very, 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 very best, but I think they're up against something really challenging.
Yeah, well, not to go political, but something we can say is this is India's attempt number 2.
Right.
And look how long it's been since attempt number 2.
Yep.
And so you can't, I mean, it's amazing and it's wonderful. And I'm so glad that they are trying again. Like, think about if they can successfully land, that shows that just because the first one wasn't successful doesn't mean the second one can't be. But like, I also think back to Bereshit and the Israeli company that launched that lander. they had planned to follow on very quickly afterwards.
Right.
And they're still planning that follow on. Well, as far as I know, they're still planning that follow on. But it's taken a lot longer. And so I think that is the problem, Michael, that we can discuss that doesn't get too political, is it is detrimental to not have successes, if only to the long-term plan and that long-term vision of being able to get that funding a second time, or get the continued funding and support, whether it be private or government, government funding. And what do you need to redo in order for that second time to be successful? And that's just the landing. That's not even the operation on the lunar surface, which is
we have no idea. We have no idea what's going to happen on. But you kind of are making the point I'm trying to get to is, because India has gone twice in 2.5 years, it actually has practical. Is it not that far? A year?
I thought they did it in like 2018, 2019. Maybe Leah can fact check us.
Compared to 50 years, it was just yesterday. So
that's my point. That's my point, is that there's people who have actually, went there, tried, didn't work, had all the modern analysis tools to evaluate what happened and not make the same errors, right? They might make different errors, but they're probably not going to make the same errors. Whereas on the other side, Russia hasn't been to the moon in 50 years, and actually I think more. And they might have the same problems that Israel and India did, right? Yes, they've been there before, but I'm sure they have the same problems with slide rulers and I'm wondering about that. And there's a lot on the line politically for Russia because of their alliance with China's lunar base. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting. And Leah says that the last lunar mission, Luna 24, took off in 1976. So that was a long time ago. Yeah. All right. Let's focus on a little bit on current events. All right. So you're focusing on building simulant and getting the simulant right, because if the testing medium is wrong, the tests are wrong, right? Is that?
Yeah, we refer to our simulants as engineered test materials rather than just simulants. And there's a very good reason for that, because when you're doing testing, that's what you're actually doing is, it's just like a pair of calipers or a calibrated scale. It has to behave right. It has to do what it's supposed to do, and it has to react properly with your test object in order for you to get meaningful results.
Yeah, the thing to keep in mind is that we are on Earth, and these are terrestrial materials. And so that's the other consideration to have is, how does this simulant interact with your system, which is also on Earth, in a test environment that is also on Earth, but you can control certain factors. So how does the humidity affect the properties? Because we know it does. How does the level of vacuum, which we also know it does? How does thermal and radiation and space weathering affect some of these different variables of not only a simulant, but also all the other aspects of testing? And so that is something to keep in mind as well, is, how are they going to interplay with one another, and what can we infer then for how it's going to operate on the lunar surface, and even the vacuum level we can't get to here on Earth. It's 10 to the negative 12 torr, and if you're lucky, you get to 10 to the negative 9. Most of the time, you get to 10 to the negative 6. And so there are some engineering, that's where engineering models can be really helpful, especially when they're combined with physical testing, is how can we take what we know or can learn here and really prepare ourselves as much as we can. And then in the case of where we don't succeed, how can we learn from that? To revise our testing. You saw that during Apollo. I mean, the amount of changes that they made from mission to mission on such a short time scale was very drastic.
Yeah.
So let's talk about regolith. You can make different simulants for different locations. and those simulants for those locations, organization ABC are going to land at 3 different locations, and you can create a simulant that is specific to each location. Yes, and it doesn't matter whether it's on we want to go to the equator. Everybody else seems to think the poles are where we want to be. What goes into that process of creating a site-specific simulant? And I'm not asking y'all to give away intellectual property. I'm just broad strokes.
There's nothing there. Really, the question is, and this is the question, if you ask me that, Michael, I would ask you immediately back is, well, is there a certain composition you're aiming for? Because if it's an area where we've been, such as the equatorial regions, especially on the near side, we have a much better idea about the composition because we physically have been there. We have samples, we have measurements from the lunar surface.
I want to go to Sinus Medea, and one of the surveyor missions landed actually really close. So
yeah,
that's actually
perfect.
Well documented. That one's good.
No, I mean, it's fine. We're clearly very passionate about this. We actually really like the custom request because it allows us to kind of look at it and see what we can do to meet those specific needs, whether it's composition or otherwise.
Give me a reason to go and dig up some really cool information about the moon.
But, in other areas, we don't have a lot of known information. And so you're relying a lot on orbital data. You're relying a lot on experts looking at how the impacts might have stirred up regolith in other areas and transported it there, or vice versa. And that's how you're going to get kind of what's called a gardening or intermixing effect in the different regions. Is you could have material, from tens or hundreds of kilometers away, depending on how big that impactor was. And so really looking at some of that data to help make inferences. And then once you have ground truth, being able to, refine your testing based off that. But as Vince said earlier, that's another reason to test in multiple simulants.
Yeah.
If you test for a specific composition, you're prepared for that composition. If you test in a range of compositions or a range of different materials, then, hopefully you're better prepared for what you might encounter, whether it's known or unknown.
Yeah, another one besides location. I mean, if somebody says, "Hey, we're going to go to Lacus Mortis," the next question after you ascertain where they're going to go is, "What are you going to be doing there? What do you need to test for?" Because no simulant, as Melissa inferred earlier, no simulant is going to be good for everything because we're dealing with terrestrial materials. So you may need to, if you're going to test a rover, you need to have a simulant that will select the mechanical properties so that you can get down into craters and come back up again. If the instruments on that rover are going to be dealing with laser ablation to try and identify the minerals in the rocks, now you need a different type of simulant.
Okay.
So you really need to understand your client or clients and what the picture is, because that rover is going to be considered a success if it can do its job to carry the payloads where they need to go, but it's also the mission is going to be considered a success if the payloads can do their job when they get there. So you really need to understand the clients and what their needs are. And sometimes in that discussion, you discover something new that you didn't know. And sometimes the clients discover new things that they didn't know. As a matter of fact, I think that's most of the time in these discussions. And so what happens is when you come out of this, you're supplying something a little bit different than you thought you were going to supply, and they're asking for something a little bit different than what they thought as well.
Well, and as you pointed out, the thermal components, does it need to live through the day into the night into the next day, or is it operating in a permanently shadowed environment? Is it operating in a permanently sunlit environment, or you're going to go ahead and let it run its 12-day course, 14-day course, 12-day course. 14
Depends on when you land.
Yeah. And you're done, right? It could be just those 14 days and be done. So let's talk about, and we only have about 15 minutes left, so keep an eye on the clock. Let's talk about the regolith itself. Okay, so I made a comment a couple weeks ago. We were at a meeting together. For folks that don't know, the NASA administrator was the guest of Senator Cantwell here in Washington State. They hosted a meeting over at Blue Origin. There were about 400 people in the room. And Melissa and Vince were there with a booth, and I was there at a booth. I was there visiting their booth, and somebody asked a question about regolith, and I made a kind of a smart ass comment. I said, if you have a choice of breathing in lunar regolith, lunar dust, or asbestos, choose asbestos, because we have knowledge that you can live about 25 years if you're breathing asbestos. And I think that number is shorter. We don't have evidence. I think that number is probably shorter if you're breathing lunar regolith. So y'all didn't like my comment. So what's wrong with my comment? Where am I in error?
And I think you actually addressed it a little bit in your follow-up just now, which you didn't address previously, and that's that we know a lot more about asbestos. Right. Lunar regolith, we're still trying to figure this out. I mean, both from the Apollo era and what the astronauts experienced, I'm sure that they monitored their health, if not, through now, then at least for a long period of time, to see the effects that it had on them. But, there's a lot of researchers right now that are also trying to figure out the effects of lunar regolith or even lunar regolith simulants on the human body. And a lot of that has to do with not only its composition and what it might contain chemically or mineralogically, but also, and this is a very fine, very abrasive material. When we talk about agglutinates, we often, refer to them like a sandbox of razor blades. Like they're just very angular, very sharp. They have a very high glass content. And that affects technology in very specific ways. It's less understood how that affects the human body. And so for that reason,
I'm going to stick with your sandbox of razor blades example for a second, because that does sound like it's a bad idea. I'm just going to...
Oh, it's not a good idea. We're going to say that way. But essentially what we're getting at is, these particles are very fine. Most of them are finer than cake flour, as an example. And they're created by impact processes. Here on Earth, we have a lot of wind and water that kind of smooths the edges. Like I was at the beach this weekend and those rocks were pretty sharp, like for sand, like not gonna lie. But most beaches, it's lovely. You want to walk barefoot. You would not want to do that on a more abrasive material, or in this case, this Washington beach that apparently needs a little bit more time with the water.
Very young beach.
Very young beach. Thank you, Vince.
Yes.
And so, going from there, it's really how can we better understand this material from those perspectives as well, so that when we do have humans go, the plan is to keep the dust out. That is the plan. You don't want to interact with it. You don't want to inhale or ingest it. But what happens if you do? And so that's what a lot of folks are looking at from more the biology side, is how will that affect humans, and what can we maybe do to help mitigate some of that as well?
What kind of instruments, what kinds of tests are we missing that we're not doing now? I know you've got a long list, but there's 2 missions on their way right now. Not to wish anything bad for either of those teams, but what's your gut tell you? Where are the problems they're gonna encounter? What are the problems they're going to encounter?
I think that, again, if they can land that is a success. It's then what happens after that. And I think that's going to depend on what a lot of their mission goals were, what sort of instruments are on them. I know Russia had a much wider range of instruments that had been originally planned than they have. And India, admittedly, I don't know entirely what is on their lander, but I'm pretty sure it does have a rover. And it's going to be analyzing samples. And so really, I think what would be great is to get more of that compositional information and that, characteristics, the properties of the regolith as well as the environment. Really better understanding the environment and its effect on the regolith will be really important. In terms of, what needs additional testing.
Well, here's the thing. This is a case where we have no idea what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That's it, exactly.
And so what we need, it's hard to say, well, here's what we're missing, because it could be such a big thing. What we need are two things. We need rapid iteration of mission and redesign, follow-on mission, redesign, follow-on mission. Because that's what happened in the Apollo program. And the later Apollo missions, the success rate of the individual tools and devices that they use, the success rate of the amount of time spent on the surface by the astronauts, and
longevity.
The distances they traveled, the samples they collected. Every time there was an iteration and a redesign followed by another iteration, there's leaps and bounds. That's what we need. That's what's got to happen. And at the same time, we need to get more than one asset on the ground at one time.
Right.
So, like, for instance, we have landers on Mars. One of them died because it had too much dust on the solar panels. If we had another rover in the area, they could have walked over and just bumped into it. Like a Roomba bumps into the chair and, wow, it's a chair, I'm going to go over here. If it could have just done that a few times, that lander would have worked a lot more. But we didn't have a rover in the area that could do that. And then the drill that got stuck because it for whatever reason, couldn't get down far enough to put the heat probe into the Martian soil. If there was another device in the area that could have come over and wiggled that a little bit more or helped it get into place, that would have been a complete success, but it wasn't. So having multiple assets in the area, at least one of them mobile that can interact with the technology, that's a game changer as well. And so what we need is those iterations, and we need more assets on the surface of them and working together. And the success rate and what you're able to accomplish is just going to go way up because of that.
Or even if it's not operational, being able to utilize what either is still operational on that asset or get spare parts from that asset to increase the longevity of the surviving craft. I mean, it'll be really interesting to see if we get to that, when we get to that point, how we can utilize that to really extend missions or enable, or enhance missions by being able to pick up an instrument that maybe is still operating and just got stuck somewhere.
Yeah.
So there's currently one operating rover out there. If all goes well, in a few days, there's going to be a second. And if all goes really, really well, in a couple of weeks, there's going to be a third. But they're not anywhere near each other. They're very intentionally not within 1,000 miles of each other. They're not going to be able to do that. So you're saying a different mission architecture, not just fast iterations and learn from the previous missions, but also a different architecture so that you've got clusters and capabilities locally to each other.
I think there's a case to be made for both because, clusters, people want to explore all these different areas of the moon. So you aren't going to want to do clusters initially. In other cases, there are companies, though, that want to develop swarms, essentially, of robots that will interact with one another. And so I think it'll be really interesting to have a mix of both, where, what can we do with a swarm? How does its longevity and its productivity really enhance like very in-depth analysis or sampling or activities at a specific area versus having more, standalone explorers, so to speak, on other areas. And I think both are great. I think there's benefits to both. But for what Vince is saying, the ability to kind of have almost like a redundancy through number is something that I think will be really interesting once we do have more activity in closer proximity to one another.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'm a big fan of clusters and swarms. I think they're an underappreciated and underutilized asset so far. So fingers crossed. With our last 5 minutes or so, I want to kind of switch gears. I want to still cover 2 topics, so we got to do them really fast. Exhaust plumes. Give us the cliff notes on exhaust plumes. How bad are they going to be? We've seen, and this is not my phrase, I wish I had come up with this. We've seen a rock tornado from SpaceX, a rock tornado, right? So we know it's going to happen within a 1 atmosphere, 1G environment with really, really, really small fraction of an atmosphere and a sixth of the gravity. That rock tornado could be vastly weirder. I don't know how else to describe it, but what happens when what happens when we've got exhaust, and not just one, but lots of missions going to the moon, lots of missions, lots of exhaust. And currently no landing pads on anywhere other than PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, it doesn't take much damage to take you out of commission in space. It really doesn't. Yeah. I mean, the Star Trek, Star Wars thing where there's massive explosion, it's not necessary. What's going to get you is that little ding that you didn't know you had.
Right.
Or the loss of the engines, like Starship experienced.
Yeah. So, it is a much bigger problem than I think it's getting, than the attention. It should be getting more attention than it does. But you could say that about so many things in the space program right now.
Well, but the reason I want to focus on this one is it doesn't just affect the launching organization. It affects everybody else who has infrastructure on the moon.
Or potentially in orbit. They're going to have particle collectors on Gateway to analyze a lot of different dust, but one of the dust is what might be kicked up.
Yeah, and this gets into that area of being a good neighbor, and that is going to be very critical. If you're not one of the hardest things to do in an environment this harsh, and this is one of the lessons that humanity learned during the exploration of Antarctica, is it's not so much getting there as living there. And whoever can live there is going to reap the benefits of it. And basically that means being a good neighbor and being able to work, in this case, on a whole different planet. I mean, as Melissa said, I mean, the reach, and as you said, the reach of doing that particular function wrong is massive. Yeah. So we do need to pay attention to it. And this is where lunar infrastructure becomes a really big deal, and NASA is really focusing on lunar infrastructure, and I think rightfully so. It's not just a landing pad, it's a lot of other things. But after you start to get more infrastructure in place on the moon, you're going to be able to do a lot more without having to fear the damage of just landing. But having said that, you're going to be exploring, which means you are always going to have landers landing in unimproved areas. When you're doing this, you can't land somewhere and then build a landing pad and then go out and prospect. That's not the way it works, at least not on a commercial basis. So you're going to have to find some way of landing in unimproved areas without negatively affecting people, halfway around.
Right. Yeah. I think it is. I think it is a really big problem. And being good neighbors, I think, is probably harder than is being credited right now. Okay. Yeah. Last topic with our last 3 minutes. Taxes. What is the story with? Like, we're all in research. We all have a role in here, and there's some rules. So what's going on?
Okay, I will try and be quick, but I have my notes since I'm an engineer. I'm not an accountant. So what our accountant said is that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017. Most of it took effect in 2018. The part that affects R&D was not supposed to actually take effect. Problem is we had a worldwide pandemic that messed up budgeting. And so it was supposed to keep getting sunset. It was in there to help pass budgets because apparently that is what they do. Well, it actually took effect in 2022. And everyone thought it was going to be, overturned or pulled at the last minute. So no one was ready for it. And then tax season hit here in spring of 2023. And essentially what it means is that it changes how R&D expenses are deducted. Instead of deducting the R&D expenses in the year that you have them and getting that lovely R&D tax credit that everyone is really excited about lately, you are required to deduct them over 6 years, with year 1 and year 6 getting a half reduction. So essentially what that means is if you had $100,000 in R&D expenses in 2022, you can't deduct that 100,000. Instead, in year 1, you only get to deduct 10,000. That means that the other 90,000 counts as taxable income in that year. And for small businesses, especially where pretty much all you do, especially in space, is research and development, that has really big implications when it comes to paying taxes on money that, again, in R&D often comes in and then goes straight back out. It's not like a lot of that is profit. Most of it is paying employees, it's paying suppliers, it's doing testing. Yeah, exactly. And so for that reason, it's really detrimental. It also affects the big businesses. And so there's a lot that is trying to kind of overturn this, but we're also dealing with a lot of other tax and budgeting and different issues right now. And so it might not actually turn over until next tax season. So it's important that it gets overturned, and then it's important that it's retroactive. In the meantime, a lot of people and a lot of businesses are going to pay a lot of extra money in sales tax, and it'll discourage people from doing research and development because they literally won't be able to afford to.
Yeah.
The tax bills on this are insane.
And what is this rule specifically? What's it called?
Tax section 174.
Tax section 174 rolls right off the tongue. Yep. Okay.
It basically slams the brakes on R&D. And when you're trying to, beat the competition to the moon, you cannot have somebody coming along and throwing an anchor around you.
Right.
And it's not, unfortunately, there's this image of it's like, oh, it's a billionaire tax credit. It's like, no, it's not. We're not billionaires.
No, definitely not. It's the small innovation. I mean, these are focused on, SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research, right? STTRs, technology transfer with universities. That is the bulk of the R&D companies in the country, and they're all affected by this rule. What is it? Rule 170.
Tax section 174. And most of them, because I tried to warn people because we did our taxes early, and people are like, oh yeah, my accountant says that's not a problem. Well, their accountant said it was a problem, and they actually went to file it because, even we have an accountant and a tax specialist, and both of them were like trying to figure out what to do with this. And so it'll be really interesting to see how this does affect companies, either short-term or long-term, especially depending on how long it takes to overturn. Because as I said, it is not an insubstantial tax increase. It is very significant.
Yikes. All right. Well, with that kind of downer moment as an ending, I apologize, but we love to have you back. I think this is a kind of a fascinating topic. Dust on the moon, whether you're there for an hour a week through the lunar night, a year, whether you're by yourself or clusters, whether you're on the equator or on the poles, all of this is not getting enough R&D. It just isn't. There are going to be errors because the work isn't getting done right now. So really think what you're doing is important. It's good work. It's good research. It's necessary. So with that, thank you very much. Appreciate you being a part of our shows, and keep us posted. All right.
Definitely. Thank you for having us, Michael.
Thank you. Bye-bye.